Okay, this is English 101. This is English 101, week 12, part 7. Week 12, part 7. This is spring of 2021. Notice, by the way, that Walker is doing something similar to what Socrates did. I think I already said this, but I'm going to say it again. Socrates, they have this whole thing with Lysias where he talks about love. And then Socrates says, let's define what love is. And Socrates' definition of love is really strange. Usually when people define love, it's like, oh, you really care about somebody a lot and you want to be with them all the time. Socrates has a definition of love that has to do with this whole complicated thing about forms in heaven that your soul saw before you were born, and that you catch a glimpse of these higher heavenly forms in earthly beauty, and that when you fall in love, you're not even really in love with a person, but you're actually in love with the beauty that your soul saw before it was put into your body, before you were born, and that the person you're in love with is going to lead you back to those higher heavenly forms. Anyway, it's a weird definition of love that we talked about in the feeders. But you can see the same thing. Walker's doing the same thing here with fear. It's a definition of fear that you don't normally think about. Fear is a kind of storytelling. Fear is not necessarily, most people think of fear as being a bad thing, but it's actually a good thing, and that it's similar to storytelling. Just like Socrates says that most people think of love as being just like when you want to have sex with someone and spend all your time with them. And Socrates says, no, there's actually a lot more. It's more interesting than that. He has a whole complicated thing about it. Walker's doing the same thing here. Cool. So let's keep going with this. Bottom of page 2. As a writer, I can tell you that a big part of writing fiction is learning how to predict how one event. Oh, actually, I wanted to back up a second. She mentions mental time travel. Humans, by the way, are the only creatures capable of thinking about the future in this way and of projecting ourselves forward in time. And this mental time travel is just one more thing that fears have in common with storytelling. Storytelling is a kind of time travel. It doesn't seem like it, but like when we read Plato, when you see those words on the page, you're reading something that was written thousands of years ago, and those ideas are now in your brain. So it's almost like Plato got to time travel to the present in your brain. Because if you don't write it, and because it's funny because Plato's against writing, but if you don't write any of your ideas down, then you have your ideas and they die with you and nobody ever finds out about them. But because Plato wrote them down, they sort of traveled in time into the far future, and now you are reading ideas and thoughts that Plato had, and those thoughts in Plato's brain are now in your brain. So it's like time traveling telepathy. And that your thoughts might be read by somebody else in the future. And of course, you can use stories to imagine what the future would be like, and that's also a kind of sort of time travel kind of thing. Okay, cool. So let's take a look at this. As a writer, I can tell you that a big part of writing fiction is learning how to predict how one event in a story will affect all the other events. And fear works in the same way. So she's continuing to connect fear and storytelling together because she thinks fear is a type of storytelling. It's a type of the imagination. And if the imagination and storytelling are good, maybe fear is good. In fear, just like in fiction, one thing always leads to another. When I was writing my first novel, The Age of Miracles, I spent months trying to figure out what would happen if the rotation of the Earth suddenly began to slow down. What would happen to our days? What would happen to our crops? What would happen to our minds? And then it was only later that I realized how very similar these questions were to the ones I used to ask myself as a frightened child in the night. What if an earthquake strikes tonight? I used to worry. What will happen to our house? What will happen to my family? And the answer to those questions always took the form of a story. So if we think of our fears as more than just fears, but as stories, we should think about ourselves as the authors of these stories. But just as importantly, we need to think of ourselves as the readers of our fears, and how we choose to read our fears can have profound effects on our lives. So again, she's continuing to connect together storytelling and fear. That you're telling stories, but then in story you want to figure out what's going to happen next. Like one of the ways to think about this is that when you're writing a story, you are intentionally coming up with a story. But when you're scared, your brain is coming up with a story you don't want to come up with. Like, I don't want to think of a story where I get on a plane and the engine explodes and the plane crashes into a mountain, but I can't help it. But she's linking these two ideas together and suggesting that there's a kind of important link. Okay. By the way, this is probably not worth pointing out, but you remember earlier in the essay when she was talking about how children have very powerful imaginations? and that they tend to have very powerful fears and also tell really like powerful stories, and that grown-ups, and she mentions Proust and Charlotte Bronte. I don't really know why she mentions Darwin. That doesn't fit as well. But the grown-ups tell stories about things like children do. They have powerful, the grown-up storytellers have powerful imagination just like children do. Notice them. Have you ever seen the movie It, which is about a demon clown creature from another dimension that haunts these children? The children are able to. The children are terrified of this because clown scares the shit. It's like a demon creature, and it scares the shit out of all of them as children. But the children have powerful imaginations, which means they're the only people who can see the monsters. The adults can't see the monster because they don't have that powerful fear that little kids have because they're told not to ever be afraid. But kids are afraid, so they can see things the adult can't see. But also notice that in the second part of the movie It, which is it's a Stephen King novel that got turned into a movie, notice in the second part of the movie It, the kids have to kind of like remember the powerful imagination that they had as kids in order to fight the monster. So that's a movie that makes a pretty big link between storytelling and fear, because the fear that allows them to see the creature, their imagination, is the thing that allows them to fight the creature. Right? It's like the same thing. Like they're the only ones that can see the creature, but recapturing the imagination of childhood is the only thing that allows them to fight the creature. Anyway, it's kind of it's an okay movie. It was all right. All right, cool. And by the way, and I believe the leader of the group, I think he's a storyteller of some kind. I want to say that he grows up to like write movies because he's supposed to be a version of Stephen King, the author. And again, he's able to access his imagination just like these authors are because there's a link between fear and storytelling. Okay, cool. So Walker says that we shouldn't think of, if you think of your fear as fear, you're gonna remember people saying, forget about your fears. Don't ever be scared of anything. Fears are stupid. Don't ever be afraid. But if you think about your fears as being like stories, well, stories are worth thinking about. So maybe you should think about your fears in the same way. And she says that just like your brain is writing the stories that happen in your brain when you're scared, you're also reading those stories. Like you have to think about yourself, not just as your brain is making the stories, but you're also kind of forced to watch them like a movie you don't want to watch. And the way you read your fears, just like the way you read a book, the way you read your fears can have profound effects on our lives. Okay, so that's what she says. Let's talk about this. This is on page 3. Now, some of us naturally read our fears more closely than others. I read about a study recently of successful entrepreneurs, and that's like inventors and business people who start their own business. And the author found that these people shared a habit he called productive paranoia, which means their paranoia is like when you're worried that people are out to get you, but they were able to use it productively, use it to something useful. The author found these people shared a habit he called productive paranoia, which meant that these people, instead of dismissing their fears, these people read them closely, and they studied them, and they translated that fear into preparation and action. So that way, if their worst fears came true, their businesses were ready. So it's the idea that what if instead of dismissing your fear, you actually spent some time thinking about your fear? Then maybe you could get prepared. So for example, if you think about your fears with COVID, then you're going to get yourself some hand sanitizer and you're going to get yourself a mask and you're going to be like, these things are going to help me fight this. Whereas if you say, fear is stupid, I will never be afraid, you don't get hand sanitizer and you don't get a mask because you think they're marks of fear or something. And then you get sick and you get the people around you sick. All right, cool. Good. It's going pretty well. And so she talks about the ways that you can use your fear. If you ignore your fears, you can't use them for anything. If you dismiss your fears and you say, this is childish, you can't use them for anything. But that if you spend time with your fear, maybe you can actually learn. Maybe you can get prepared. Maybe you can figure out which fears are real or more likely to be real, which kind of fears are stupid, and which are the ones you should maybe be thinking about a little bit more, right? If you're scared of the dark, that's probably silly. But if you're scared of getting sick when there's a pandemic on, that one might be worth thinking a little bit more about. If you're scared of getting the vaccine, you might want to think about that a little bit, and maybe you'll figure out that it's actually a good idea to get the vaccine. And that, yeah, the vaccine is scary, but the disease is scarier. That's why I got my vaccine. I don't know. The vaccine was a kind of, it was sort of an experimentally kind of vaccine, I guess. They created it really quickly. And people were like, well, you're not scared about that vaccine? I said, well, I'm a little scared about the vaccine, but I'm like way more scared of COVID, and I can make a rational decision and really think about it. Whereas if you're just like, fear is always bad, Or if you're like, vaccines are scary, like these things are not going to help you out. All right, I'll see you guys in the next video.